Montana Territory, 1878. The small frontier town of Silver Creek clung to the edge of civilization like a stubborn burr on a saddle blanket. Dust swirled through unpainted wooden buildings where the sound of hammers striking nails competed with piano notes spilling from the saloon. Progress and wilderness existed in uneasy balance here, just as they did in the heart of Tom Ellis. Tom dismounted his dun-colored gelding outside the general store, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the late afternoon sun. At 25 years old, he cut an impressive figure with broad shoulders honed from years of ranch work, though his clean-shaven face and clear blue eyes maintained a boyish quality that belied the hardness the frontier had already carved into him. He secured his horse with practiced efficiency, adjusting his worn Stetson to shield his eyes from the relentless Montana sun. The trail dust coating his denim pants and faded blue shirt told the story of a long ride, but he moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to frontier hardship. The leather holster at his hip held a Colt revolver, not worn for show, but necessity in these parts. 3 years riding for the Circle M Ranch had taught Tom one indisputable truth. In the West, a man survived by relying on himself and nothing more. Sentiment was dangerous, attachment was foolish. The graveyard on the edge of town offered silent testimony to those who'd forgotten this harsh reality. He'd watched too many good men broken by loss, cowhands who'd risked their hearts only to see wives and children claimed by disease, outlaws, or the merciless elements. "No point in planting roots in shifting sand," he muttered, repeating the mantra that had served him since his parents' deaths left him orphaned at 16. What Tom wanted was simple: to save enough to stake his own claim, build a modest ranch, and answer to no one but himself. What he needed, though he wouldn't admit it even in the privacy of his thoughts, was something to fill the emptiness that stretched before him like the endless Montana prairie. He pushed open the wooden door of Morgan's General Store, the small bell announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that seemed at odds with his mood. The familiar scents of coffee beans, leather goods, and dried tobacco greeted him as he nodded a silent greeting to old Jacob Morgan behind the counter. "Afternoon, Tom." "Walter sent you for the supplies?" Jacob called out, referring to the Circle M's foreman. "Yes, sir, got the list right here," Tom replied, pulling a folded paper from his shirt pocket. As Jacob began gathering the items, Tom turned to survey the store's other occupants, a habit born of frontier caution. That's when he saw her, standing near the fabric bolts, her slender fingers tracing the pattern of a blue calico. Tessa Finley had arrived in Silver Creek just 2 weeks prior, but already her presence had stirred conversation throughout the small community. At 20 years old, she possessed a beauty that seemed out of place against the raw backdrop of the frontier. Her chestnut hair, gathered in a neat bun at the nape of her neck, caught golden highlights from the afternoon sun streaming through the dusty windows. Her dress, though simple and practical in pale yellow calico, couldn't disguise the grace with which she moved. But it wasn't her beauty that captured Tom's attention. It was the shadow in her hazel eyes, a wariness that reminded him of wild horses newly captured. She carried herself with deliberate control, as though one wrong move might shatter something fragile within her. Tom knew little about her beyond the whispers that had circulated through town. She'd arrived on the eastbound stage with just 2 trunks and taken a position as the new schoolteacher. Some claimed she was running from something back east. Others insisted she was a widow, though she wore no mourning clothes. Tom had made it a point not to wonder. Other people's business was their own in the West, at least it should be. Tessa felt his gaze and looked up, her expression immediately shuddering. She gathered the fabric she'd been examining and moved toward the counter, clearly intending to complete her purchase and leave. As she approached, Tom stepped aside, tipping his hat in silent acknowledgement. "Miss Finley," he said, the politeness ingrained by his long-dead mother surfacing despite his determination to keep his distance. "Mr. Ellis," she replied with a nod so brief it barely qualified as acknowledgement. There was something in her voice, a cultured Eastern accent that had not yet been worn away by frontier life. She stood at the counter, her back straight as a fence post, waiting as Jacob finished gathering Tom's supplies. "I can wait, Mr. Morgan," she said softly. "Please finish with Mr. Ellis first." "Nonsense, Miss Finley. Just need to measure this fabric for you, won't take but a minute," Jacob insisted, abandoning Tom's order to attend to hers. Tom noticed the way her shoulders tensed when Jacob moved toward her, though the storekeeper was harmless as an old hound. There was history there, not with Jacob specifically, but with men in general. Tom recognized the signs from horses that had been mistreated. They flinched at sudden movements even years later. Once Jacob had cut and wrapped her fabric, Tessa paid quickly and turned to leave, her gaze fixed firmly on the door. She attempted to move past Tom with a wide berth, but in the narrow confines of the store, her skirt brushed against his leg. He saw it then, a faint bruise at her wrist, partially concealed by her sleeve but revealed when she reached to steady herself against a shelf. It was yellowing, old but still visible, the kind of mark left by fingers gripping too tightly. Before he could consider the wisdom of his actions, words escaped him. "Who hurt you, Miss Finley?" Her reaction was immediate, shock followed by a flash of fear and then carefully constructed indignation. She pulled her sleeve down firmly and drew herself up to her full height, though she still stood nearly a foot shorter than his 6'1" frame. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Ellis." "That is extremely inappropriate," she said, her voice low but sharp. "My apologies," Tom replied, recognizing his misstep, "but out here folks look out for each other. If someone's causing trouble—" "The only person causing trouble at present is you," she interrupted, color rising in her cheeks. "Good day." With that, she swept past him and out the door, the bell jangling in her wake. Jacob Morgan chuckled as he returned to Tom's order. "That's the most words I've heard from either of you since she arrived. Might not have been the best first conversation." Tom frowned. Wasn't trying to have a conversation at all. But as Jacob gathered the flour, coffee, and other supplies for the ranch, Tom couldn't shake the image of that bruise or the flash of vulnerability in her eyes before the wall came down. It stirred something in him, a protective instinct he thought he'd buried alongside his parents. "She staying at the Widow Patterson's boarding house?" Tom asked, trying to sound casual. Jacob nodded. "Teaching our young uns starts next week when the schoolhouse repairs are finished. Seems a bit delicate for frontier life, if you ask me." Tom paid for the supplies and loaded them onto his horse, his thoughts still lingering on the schoolteacher. He told himself his concern was merely the instinctive response any decent man would have upon seeing a woman in trouble. Nothing more. As he mounted and turned his horse toward the ranch, he caught sight of Tessa Finley walking briskly down the boardwalk, her back straight, her pace purposeful. She didn't look back. "Not my business," he muttered to himself, spurring his horse forward. "Not my business at all." But even as he rode away from Silver Creek, Tom knew something had shifted. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking of someone beyond himself, and that was dangerous territory indeed. 2 days later, a summer thunderstorm descended on Silver Creek with biblical fury. Tom had returned to town to mail a letter for the ranch owner when the skies opened. He took shelter under the overhang of the mercantile, watching as the unpaved street quickly turned to mud. Through the curtain of rain, he spotted a familiar figure hurrying down the boardwalk, clutching papers to her chest. Tessa Finley was fighting a losing battle against the elements, her skirts already sodden, her hat providing little protection against the downpour. Without thinking, Tom stepped into the rain and crossed to her side of the street. "Miss Finley," he called over the storm's roar, "let me help you." She startled at his voice, nearly dropping her papers. "Mr. Ellis." "I'm quite capable." A powerful gust of wind chose that moment to rip through the street, tearing several papers from her grasp. Tom moved quickly, capturing the escaping documents before they could be swept away. "Your student's work?" he asked, noticing the childish handwriting. "Yes," she admitted reluctantly, accepting them back with cold fingers. "Thank you." Another flash of lightning illuminated the darkened street, followed by a crash of thunder that seemed to shake the wooden buildings. Tessa flinched visibly. "The boarding house is 6 blocks away," Tom said. "The cafe is right here. Let me buy you a cup of coffee while the worst passes." He expected resistance, but to his surprise, she glanced at the swirling black clouds and nodded. "Just until the rain eases," she conceded. The cafe was warm and smelled of fresh bread and coffee. Only 2 other patrons sat at tables, both nodding respectfully as Tom and Tessa entered. Tom guided her to a table near the stove, careful not to touch her, but remaining close enough to project an air of protection that would discourage unwanted attention. "2 coffees, Mrs. Holloway," he called to the proprietress, a plump widow who ran the establishment with military efficiency. Tessa arranged her damp papers carefully on the edge of the table away from the remaining droplets that fell from her clothing. Her chestnut hair had partially escaped its pins, curling damply around a face flushed from exertion. "I should apologize for my behavior at the store," Tom said, as Mrs. Holloway delivered 2 steaming mugs. "It wasn't my place to comment." Tessa wrapped her cold fingers around the mug but didn't drink. "No," she agreed, "it wasn't." Her directness surprised him. Most women he'd encountered either simpered or scolded. They didn't simply state facts without embellishment. "But," she continued after a moment, "your intention appeared to be concern rather than gossip. That's uncommon in my experience." Tom watched as she finally took a sip of coffee, her eyes closing briefly at the warmth. "Silver Creek isn't perfect," he said, "but most folks here are decent. They mind their business, but they'll also lend a hand when needed." "Is that why you're here? Because you're decent?" The question held a challenge, but her voice had softened. "I'm here because it's raining," Tom replied with a slight smile, "and because no one should have to walk 6 blocks in a downpour." For the first time, he saw her lips curve upward, though the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "A practical man, Mr. Ellis." "Tom," he corrected, "Mr. Ellis was my father." She hesitated, then nodded. "Tom, then, and I suppose you may call me Tessa, though not in front of the students when classes begin." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, listening to the rain hammer against the roof and windows. Tom noted how she gradually relaxed, her shoulders losing some of their rigidity as the warmth of the cafe and the coffee worked their magic. "Have you always been a teacher?" he asked eventually. "No," she answered, then seemed to consider how much to share. "I was raised to be a proper Boston wife. Teaching was an unexpected path." Tom nodded, recognizing the boundaries in her response. "And I was raised to take over my father's freight business in Missouri. Life has its own plans, I suppose." "What happened?" she asked, then immediately looked regretful. "Forgive me, that's personal." "Raiders during the war," Tom replied simply. "I was 16, took what I could carry and headed west." Understanding passed between them, the unspoken recognition of shared loss, different in circumstances but similar in impact. "And now you work at the Circle M," she said. Tom raised an eyebrow. "You've been asking about me." A flush deepened the color in her cheeks. "Small towns have active grapevines, Mr. Ellis, Tom. I've heard about most residents without actively seeking information." "Fair enough," he acknowledged with a smile. "Yes, I ride for the Circle M have for 3 years now." "Do you enjoy it?" The question seemed genuinely curious. Tom considered. "Parts of it. I like working with the horses, being outdoors, it's honest work." "But not what you want forever," she observed perceptively. He studied her for a moment, surprised by her insight. "No," he admitted. "I'm saving for my own place, something small, manageable by one man." "Alone," the word escaped her before she could catch herself. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment the cafe and storm faded away. Tom saw something in her gaze, recognition perhaps. She understood isolation as he did. "It's safer that way," he said quietly. She looked down at her coffee. "Yes," she whispered, "I suppose it is." The door to the cafe banged open, breaking the moment as a drenched Sheriff Dawson entered, shaking water from his hat. His eyes landed on their table, and his bushy eyebrows rose slightly before he nodded a greeting. "Miss Finley Ellis," he said, making his way to the counter. Tessa immediately straightened, her teacher's posture returning. She gathered her papers, now dry enough to transport. "The rain seems to be letting up. I should continue to the boarding house." Tom glanced outside. The downpour had indeed softened to a steady drizzle. "I'll walk you," he offered, already reaching for his hat. "That isn't necessary." 6 blocks of muddy streets in those shoes. Tom gestured to her impractical boots, clearly not designed for frontier conditions. "Mrs. Patterson would have my hide if I let her star boarder ruin her floors." This earned him a genuine smile, small but real. "Very well," she conceded, "for Mrs. Patterson's floors." As they exited the cafe, Tom offered his arm without thinking. Tessa hesitated before placing her gloved hand lightly upon it. Through the layers of clothing, he could feel her tension, and the moment when she deliberately relaxed her grip. They walked in silence for a block, navigating around puddles, before Tessa spoke again. "To answer your question from the store," she said so quietly he almost missed it beneath the patter of rain. It was my fiancé, in Boston. Tom's step faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly, careful not to react in a way that might make her regret her confidence. Ex-fiancé, I presume? He asked, keeping his tone neutral despite the anger building in his chest. Yes, she confirmed. Breaking our engagement caused quite the scandal, especially since I couldn't explain the true reasons. His family has considerable influence. So you came west. As far as possible, she admitted. Teaching was the only respectable profession available to me without references or connections. They stopped at a corner to allow a wagon to pass, wheels flinging mud in their wake. Tom positioned himself to shield Tessa from the spray. Thank you, she said, and he knew she meant for more than just the protection from mud. If he ever shows his face in Silver Creek, Tom said carefully, you have friends here now. She looked up at him with surprise. Friends? Well, at least one, he clarified with a small smile, and I'm handy in a fight. For the first time, Tessa laughed, a brief, genuine sound quickly stifled, as though she'd forgotten she was capable of it. I'll remember that. They continued to the boarding house, where Tom left her at the door with a tip of his hat and a promise to check that the schoolhouse repairs were progressing properly. As he walked back through the rain toward the livery where his horse waited, Tom realized with uneasy clarity that he'd broken his own cardinal rule. He'd gotten involved, and worse, he wanted to stay involved. The following weeks brought an unseasonable heat to Silver Creek, turning the days long and languid. Tom found reasons to visit town more frequently than usual, supplies that couldn't wait, messages that suddenly seemed urgent, horses that needed the blacksmith's attention. Each visit inevitably included a casual pass by the newly repaired schoolhouse where Tessa had begun teaching Silver Creek's children. Sometimes he caught only glimpses of her through the window, pointing at a slate board or bending to help a student. Other times he arrived as lessons ended, tipping his hat as children streamed past him, Tessa following with books in her arms and an expression that shifted from professional composure to cautious warmth upon seeing him. These encounters built slowly, like a house constructed one careful brick at a time. A conversation about the town's harvest festival. An offer to carry her books, walking her to the boarding house in the golden light of late afternoon. Small moments that should have meant nothing but somehow accumulated into something Tom couldn't or wouldn't name. On a particularly stifling August afternoon, Tom arrived in town to find the schoolhouse doors open to catch any stray breeze. Children's voices recited multiplication tables in sing-song rhythm as he tied his horse to the hitching post. He waited, hat in hand, as the school day concluded and the children raced for freedom. Tessa appeared in the doorway, her face flushed from the heat, a few tendrils of hair clinging damply to her neck. She wore a light blue dress with white trim, practical but flattering. Her surprise at seeing him quickly transformed into a smile. Tom, she acknowledged, what brings you to town today? Walter needed supplies, he answered, gesturing vaguely toward the general store, though his errands were already complete. Thought I might check if you needed anything carried back to the boarding house. She studied him for a moment, seeming to debate something internally. Actually, she said finally, I was planning to visit the creek. The children mentioned a swimming hole, and I thought it might offer some relief from the heat. Tom raised an eyebrow, alone. Mrs. Patterson suggested it, Tessa explained. Said it's where the ladies often go to escape the summer heat. It's about a mile west, Tom said. Not far, but not exactly a casual stroll in this heat either. Tessa's determined expression faltered slightly. Oh. Perhaps another day then. I could take you, Tom offered, the words emerging before he'd fully considered them. My horse can carry both of us that distance easily enough. He saw hesitation flash across her features, propriety warring with the misery of the stifling boarding house that awaited her. It's perfectly respectable, he assured her. The swimming spot is separated into ladies' and men's sections by a bend in the creek and a stand of willows. Half the town might be there on a day like today. Very well, she decided, squaring her shoulders with the same determination she showed when facing down rowdy students. Let me get my things. She disappeared briefly into the schoolhouse, emerging with a small bundle wrapped in a cloth. Tom helped her lock the building, then led her to his horse. I'll need to, he cleared his throat. That is, may I assist you up? Tessa nodded, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Tom placed his hands at her waist, feeling the stiff fabric of her corset beneath the dress as he lifted her easily into the saddle. He swung up behind her, careful to maintain as much distance as possible while still ensuring her safety. Hold onto the pommel, he instructed, reaching around her to take the reins. The ride to the creek passed in charged silence, both acutely aware of their proximity. Tom kept his attention fixed firmly on the trail ahead, ignoring the scent of lavender that rose from her hair or the way she gradually relaxed against him as the horse's steady gait lulled her tensions away. The creek revealed itself as a ribbon of glittering water cutting through the golden landscape. As Tom had predicted, several families had already claimed spots along its banks, with women and children splashing in the shallows while men gathered under shade trees playing cards or smoking pipes. He guided his horse to a relatively secluded spot where a massive cottonwood offered shade and the creek widened into a natural pool. Beyond a bend, and partially screened by willows, lay the designated men's swimming area. The ladies usually change behind those bushes, Tom explained, dismounting before helping Tessa down. Her hands rested on his shoulders momentarily, and he caught the flicker of something unguarded in her eyes before she stepped back. Thank you, she said. Will you remain nearby? Tom nodded. I'll take care of my horse and perhaps cool off myself. Take your time. He busied himself with unsaddling and tethering his horse where it could graze, deliberately giving Tessa privacy as she made her way to the changing area with several other women who had arrived. When she emerged, she wore a modest bathing costume that covered her from neck to knees, her hair pinned up securely. Even in this practical garment, Tom thought she looked beautiful, especially with the genuine smile that transformed her face as she waded tentatively into the water. He watched as she gradually grew bolder, submerging herself to her shoulders in the cool creek. The sound of her laughter as she splashed with some of her students who recognized their teacher carried across the water, stirring something in his chest. Tom retreated to the men's section, stripping down to his underclothes for his own swim. The cold water was a welcome shock against his sun-heated skin, and he allowed himself to float on his back, staring up at the endless Montana sky. For the first time in years, he felt something like contentment. Later, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, they sat together on a blanket Tessa had brought, sharing fresh bread, cheese, and apples she'd purchased that morning. I haven't done anything like this since I was a child, she admitted, watching as families began to pack up their belongings for the journey home. She had changed back into her dress, though her damp hair hung in a single braid down her back, making her look younger and more carefree. Swimming, Tom asked. Being unguarded, she clarified. In Boston, every action was observed and judged, even more so after. She trailed off, but Tom understood, after the broken engagement, after the bruises. The West has its own rules, he said. Harsher in some ways, but simpler in others. People judge less on where you came from and more on what you do now. Tessa nodded, pulling her knees to her chest and wrapping her arms around them. Is that why you stayed, after losing your parents? Tom considered the question, watching the play of late afternoon light on the water. Partly, he admitted. But mostly because out here expectations are clear. Nature doesn't lie to you, animals don't betray you, you know where you stand. Unlike people, she said softly. Unlike some people, he corrected, finding himself studying her profile. She turned to meet his gaze, something vulnerable and questioning in her expression. Tom, The moment was shattered by shouts from downstream, angry voices rising above the peaceful sounds of the creek. Tom was on his feet instantly, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun he wasn't wearing. Stay here, he instructed, scanning for the source of the disturbance. Around the bend, partially visible through the willows, a confrontation was unfolding. Two men, cowboys by their dress, were squaring off, their postures aggressive. Tom recognized one as Jade Harris, a troublemaker who rode for a neighboring ranch. The other was younger, barely more than a boy. I should check on my students, Tessa said, also rising. No, Tom said firmly. Harris is drunk and looking for trouble. Get your things together, we'll leave if this escalates. As if on cue, the first punch was thrown. Women began gathering children, moving away from the fight. Tom watched tensely, ready to intervene if firearms appeared, relieved when other men moved to separate the combatants. Tom, Tessa's voice drew his attention. She stood with her bundle already gathered, concern etched across her features. He nodded, collecting the remains of their picnic. "Let's go." They made their way quickly to where his horse waited. Tom helped Tessa mount, then swung up behind her, urging the animal into a trot as they left the creek behind. He felt her trembling slightly against him. "Are you cold?" he asked. "No," she answered quietly, "just reminded." Tom understood immediately. Violence of any kind would trigger memories of her former fiancé. Without thinking, he tightened one arm around her waist, a protective gesture that she didn't resist. "You're safe," he said simply. She didn't respond, but gradually the tension in her body eased. By the time they reached the outskirts of Silver Creek, the trembling had stopped. Tom pulled the horse to a halt before they entered town properly. "We should arrive separately," he said reluctantly, "for your reputation." Tessa twisted slightly to look at him, surprise evident in her expression. "You're concerned about my reputation." "People talk," he explained. "A schoolteacher needs the town's respect." Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by something warmer. "Thank you," she said. "Not many men would consider that." Tom helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "I'll wait here until you're out of sight, then follow." She nodded but made no move to leave. Instead, she looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "Today was lovely," she said finally. "Despite the ending." "We could do it again," Tom suggested, surprising himself. "There's a spot farther upstream, more private. I could take you Sunday after church." The invitation hung between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to acknowledge. Tessa's cheeks colored slightly, but her eyes remained steady on his. "Yes," she said simply, "I'd like that." She turned and walked toward town, her blue dress catching the last golden rays of sunset. Tom remained motionless, watching until she disappeared around a corner. Only then did he acknowledge the truth he'd been avoiding for weeks. Tessa Finley had become more than just a woman he'd helped. She'd become someone who mattered. And that reality terrified him more than any gunfight ever could. Their Sunday excursion never happened. Saturday evening brought word of cattle rustlers hitting the northern section of Circle M land. Tom and the other hands spent days tracking the thieves through rough country, returning to the ranch exhausted, dirty, and empty-handed. By the time he made it back to Silver Creek, nearly 2 weeks had passed. He felt the absence of Tessa like a physical thing, a hollow space that grew more noticeable with each passing day. This reaction alarmed him. He'd spent years cultivating independence, teaching himself not to need anyone. Yet here he was, riding into town with his heart pounding in anticipation of seeing a woman he barely knew. The schoolhouse windows glowed with lamplight despite the late hour. Tom dismounted, tethering his horse to the hitching post before approaching. Through the window, he could see Tessa at her desk, head bent over papers, a single lamp illuminating her work. Her chestnut hair was pinned up as always, but several strands had escaped to curl against her neck. He knocked softly on the door. She startled, looking up with momentary alarm that transformed into surprised recognition. She rose quickly, smoothing her skirt before opening the door. "Tom," she said, his name carrying questions she didn't voice. "Evening, Miss Finley," he replied formally, aware they were in public view. "Sorry to disturb your work." "Not at all," she answered, stepping back to allow him entry. "Please come in." He removed his hat as he stepped inside, suddenly conscious of his trail-worn appearance. He hadn't taken time to clean up properly, eager as he was to see her. "You've been away," she observed, closing the door but leaving it slightly ajar for propriety's sake. "Rustlers," he explained, "hit the North Range. We tracked them into Idaho territory before losing the trail." Tessa studied his face, noting the fatigue etched there. "You look exhausted." "It's been a long week," he admitted. "I wanted to apologize for missing our outing." "There's nothing to apologize for," she assured him, returning to her desk and gesturing for him to take a seat at one of the student benches. "Your work comes first." Tom lowered himself onto the bench, feeling oversized in the small space designed for children. "What keeps you working so late?" "Essays," she sighed, indicating the stack of papers. "On the importance of the Transcontinental Railroad. Some have rather imaginative views on the subject." Tom smiled, grateful for the easy conversation after days of terse exchanges with frustrated cowhands. I imagine Silver Creek's children have limited experience with railroads. Precisely, she agreed with a small laugh. Billy Thompson believes trains can jump over mountains if given sufficient speed. They fell into comfortable conversation, Tessa sharing amusing stories from her teaching, while Tom described the vast wilderness he'd traversed during the pursuit. As they talked, he observed subtle changes in her demeanor, a new confidence in the way she spoke, less guardedness in her expressions. Silver Creek was changing her, or perhaps allowing her true self to emerge from behind the protective walls she'd built. "I should let you finish your work," Tom said eventually, noting the lateness of the hour. "Actually, I was about to head back to the boarding house," Tessa replied, gathering her papers. Would you mind walking with me?" "I'd be honored," he said sincerely. As they walked through the quiet town, stars blanketing the sky above them, Tom felt a growing certainty that he was approaching a crossroads in his life. The path of solitude he'd chosen years ago no longer seemed as clear or as necessary as it once had. "I missed our conversation," Tessa said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "While you were gone." Tom glanced down at her, surprised by the admission. "I missed it too," he confessed, "thought about it during long nights on the trail." They stopped outside the boarding house, its windows dark except for a single lamp left burning in the entryway. Neither seemed eager to end their time together. "Tom," Tessa began hesitantly, "may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." She looked up at him, her expression serious in the moonlight. "Why do you believe it's safer to be alone? What happened to make you choose solitude?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. For a moment, he considered deflecting with a partial truth about the dangers of frontier life. But something in her gaze demanded honesty. "My parents," he said finally. "They loved each other completely. When raiders killed my father during the war, my mother, she simply gave up, stopped eating, stopped caring. Died within months." He paused, the memory still painful despite the years. "I decided then that loving someone that much was too dangerous, better to rely on yourself." Tessa's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers cool against his calloused palm. "I understand," she said softly. "After Richard, my former fiancé, I made similar vows, to never trust, never depend on anyone." "And now?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at him, moonlight silvering her features. "Now I'm not so certain those vows were wise." The moment stretched between them, fraught with possibility. Tom found himself leaning slightly forward, drawn by something powerful and undeniable. Tessa's breath caught, her lips parting slightly. The boarding house door opened suddenly, spilling light onto the porch. Mrs. Patterson stood silhouetted in the doorway, her expression suggesting she'd been watching through the window. "Miss Finley," she called, "quite late, isn't it?" The moment shattered, Tessa stepped back quickly, releasing Tom's hand. "Yes, Mrs. Patterson, I was just grading papers at the school." The older woman hummed skeptically. "Good evening, Mr. Ellis." "Ma'am," Tom acknowledged with a tip of his hat. Tessa glanced back at him with an apologetic smile. "Thank you for the escort, Mr. Ellis." "My pleasure, Miss Finley," he replied formally, watching as she ascended the steps and disappeared inside. As Tom walked back to his horse, his mind replayed their conversation. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that his carefully constructed philosophy might be flawed. That perhaps the very isolation he'd created to protect himself had become a prison of its own making. Autumn arrived in Montana with brutal swiftness, painting the landscape in fiery hues before stripping the trees bare. Tom found himself in town more frequently as the Circle M prepared for winter, stocking supplies and finishing repairs that couldn't wait for spring. His relationship with Tessa developed through these visits, careful, measured interactions that maintained propriety while deepening their connection. They established routines. Tom would arrive as school dismissed, help her close up the building, then walk her to the boarding house, sometimes stopping at the cafe if weather permitted. Occasionally, they attended church socials or community gatherings together, always careful to include others in their conversations to avoid appearing too exclusive. By late October, when the first snow dusted the mountains, their attachment was an acknowledged fact in Silver Creek, though both maintained a careful reserve that kept gossip to a minimum. On a crisp Saturday afternoon, Tom arrived at the boarding house to escort Tessa to the Harvest Festival. Mrs. Patterson answered his knock with a knowing smile. She's just finishing getting ready, the landlady informed him. Do come in from the cold. Tom waited in the modest parlor, hat in hand, unusually nervous. The Harvest Festival was the social event of the season, and attending together would make a public statement about their relationship that couldn't be misinterpreted. Footsteps on the stairs announced Tessa's arrival. Tom rose, words failing him as she appeared in the doorway. She wore a dress he hadn't seen before, deep green wool with black trim that complemented her chestnut hair, which she'd arranged in an elaborate style with a few curls framing her face. A simple cameo brooch at her throat completed the ensemble. You look beautiful, he said finally when he remembered how to speak. Tessa blushed, the color enhancing her natural beauty. Thank you, is it too much, Mrs. Patterson helped me alter one of my Boston dresses. It's perfect, Tom assured her, offering his arm. Shall we? The town square had been transformed for the festival. Lanterns hung from wires strung between buildings, casting golden light over tables laden with autumn bounty. A platform had been erected for musicians, and already fiddle music filled the air as couples danced on a wooden floor constructed for the occasion. Their arrival together drew notice, though most reactions were approving smiles or knowing nods. Tom felt a surge of pride walking beside Tessa, aware of the admiring glances she received. More surprising was his lack of discomfort at being part of a pair. For someone who had valued independence above all, he found himself unexpectedly pleased to be publicly associated with her. The evening progressed pleasantly as they sampled harvest foods, conversed with townspeople, and watched children play games organized by the church ladies. When the music shifted to a waltz, Tom turned to Tessa hesitantly. Would you care to dance? He asked, half expecting her to decline. Instead, she nodded, a shy smile playing at her lips. I'd like that very much. Tom led her to the dance floor, placing one hand properly at her waist while taking her gloved hand in his. It had been years since he danced, but the steps returned to him as they began to move in time with the music. You dance well, Tessa remarked, surprise evident in her voice. My mother insisted, Tom explained, guiding her through a turn. Said no son of hers would stumble around a dance floor like a newborn colt. Tessa laughed, the sound warming him more effectively than any fire. She was wise. She would have liked you, he said without thinking. The simple statement carried weight beyond the words themselves. Tessa's eyes softened as she recognized the significance. He was connecting her to his past, to the family he had lost, to the part of himself he kept carefully guarded. I wish I could have known her, she replied softly. They continued dancing, drawing closer with each turn until the proper distance between them had diminished considerably. Tom was acutely aware of every point of contact, his hand at her waist, her palm against his, the occasional brush of her skirts against his legs. As the music ended, neither moved immediately to separate. Something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been building for months. The moment was interrupted by Sheriff Dawson, who approached with an apologetic expression. Hate to disturb you folks, he said, but there's a situation needs addressing, Tom. Tom reluctantly released Tessa, though he kept her hand in his. What kind of situation? Jade Harris and his boys are getting rowdy at the saloon, Dawson explained. Threatening to come disrupt the festival, could use some help keeping them in line. Tom's jaw tightened. Harris had been a persistent troublemaker since the Creek incident. Of course. Let me see Miss Finley safely settled first. I'll be fine, Tessa assured him. Mrs. Thompson was just asking for help with the pie judging. Tom hesitated, torn between duty and desire. I won't be long, he promised. Be careful, she replied, concern evident in her eyes. With a reassuring squeeze of her hand, Tom departed with the sheriff, looking back once to see Tessa already engaged in conversation with the minister's wife. The situation at the saloon proved worse than described. Harris and 3 other cowboys were deeply intoxicated, threatening the bartender and breaking furniture. It took Tom, the sheriff, and 2 other men to subdue them and secure them in the town's small jail. They'll sleep it off till morning, Sheriff Dawson sighed, locking the cell door on the cursing men. Thanks for the assistance. They mention why they're causing trouble, Tom asked, wiping blood from a split lip where Harris had landed a lucky punch. Something about being cheated at cards last week, Dawson replied, though with Harris it doesn't take much reason. Tom nodded, glancing out the window to see the festival still in full swing. I should get back. That schoolteacher's a fine woman, Dawson commented casually. Seems to have settled in well here. She has, Tom agreed, unwilling to discuss Tessa with anyone else, even the well-meaning sheriff. Just saying, Dawson continued, apparently undeterred by Tom's reticence, it's good to see you taking an interest. Been riding solo too long. Tom didn't respond to this observation, merely nodded farewell and headed back to the festival. He scanned the crowd for Tessa, finally spotting her near the refreshment table, deep in conversation with a stranger. The man stood with his back to Tom, expensively dressed in a suit that marked him as an outsider, his posture rigid and commanding. Even from a distance, Tom could see the tension in Tessa's body, the way her hands gripped her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Tom quickened his pace, instinct telling him something was wrong. As he drew closer, he caught fragments of their conversation. Absolutely ridiculous, the man was saying, his accent distinctly Eastern. Your father is beside himself. I made my position clear, Tessa replied, her voice tight but controlled. Please leave, Richard. The name hit Tom like a physical blow. Richard, her former fiancé. The man who had left bruises on her wrists, who had driven her across the country seeking safety. Tom reached them in 3 long strides. Everything all right, Tessa? He asked, deliberately using her first name while positioning himself slightly in front of her. The man turned, revealing a handsome face set in aristocratic lines, cold eyes assessing Tom with obvious disdain. And who might you be? He inquired, his tone suggesting Tom was barely worth acknowledging. Tom Ellis, he answered evenly, a friend of Miss Finley's. Richard's mouth curled in a humorless smile. Ah, yes, the cowboy. Tessa mentioned you in her letter to her father. Tom glanced at Tessa, whose face had drained of color. Richard, please, she said quietly, this isn't the place. On the contrary, Richard replied, it's perfect. I've come to bring you home, Tessa, this little adventure has gone on long enough. I'm not going anywhere with you, Tessa stated firmly, though Tom could see her hands trembling. Don't be dramatic, Richard sighed, as if dealing with a petulant child. Your father has arranged everything. The scandal has died down. We can announce our engagement again by Christmas. Tom felt a surge of protective fury. I believe the lady said she's not interested. Richard's eyes narrowed as he fully assessed Tom for the first time, taking in the worn clothes, the trail dust, the fresh bruise forming where Harris had struck him. This is a private conversation between my fiancé and myself, he said dismissively. Your services aren't required. Ex-fiancé, Tessa corrected, her voice gaining strength. And Tom stays. A flash of something dangerous crossed Richard's features, so quick Tom might have missed it if he hadn't been watching closely. It was the look of a man unaccustomed to being denied. Perhaps we should continue this discussion tomorrow, Richard suggested smoothly, his composure returning, when you've had time to think rationally. I'm staying at the hotel. There's nothing to discuss, Tessa insisted. Please go back to Boston, Richard. After traveling all this way, Richard laughed without humor. I think not. We'll speak tomorrow. His eyes flicked to Tom with undisguised contempt. Alone. With that, he turned and walked away, his bearing regal despite the muddy street. Tom watched him go, cataloging everything about the man, his movements, his mannerisms, the barely contained violence beneath his polished exterior. When Richard was out of earshot, Tom turned to Tessa, who looked as though she might collapse. Let's get you somewhere quiet, he said gently, offering his arm for support. She nodded mutely, allowing him to guide her away from the festival toward the schoolhouse, which stood dark and empty nearby. Inside, Tom lit a lamp and pulled a chair for her, concern mounting as he noted her pallor and shallow breathing. How did he find me? She whispered, more to herself than to Tom. You wrote to your father? Tom asked, kneeling beside her chair. Tessa nodded, just once to let him know I was safe. I didn't say where exactly, just that I'd found a position teaching out west. She looked up, realization dawning. The school board, when they confirmed my appointment, they must have responded to my references. What happened between you? In Boston, Tom asked, needing to understand the full situation they faced. Tessa's hands twisted in her lap. Richard Blackmore comes from one of Boston's oldest families. Our engagement was arranged by our fathers, a business merger as much as a marriage. At first he was charming, attentive. Her voice faltered. But there were signs I ignored, how he spoke to servants, how he reacted when contradicted. She drew a shaky breath before continuing. 2 months before the wedding, I expressed some doubts about our compatibility. His response was violent. He apologized afterward, of course. Blamed it on wedding pressure, too much drink. I wanted to believe him. But it happened again, Tom guessed, his jaw tightening. Yes, she confirmed quietly. The second time, I realized it would be my life if I married him, so I broke the engagement publicly. His family was humiliated. There were threats, thinly veiled. My father tried to convince me to reconsider. She looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I left that night. Took what money I had saved and traveled west, applying for teaching positions along the way. Tom fought to control his anger, focusing instead on the immediate threat. What will he do now? He won't leave easily, Tessa said with certainty. Richard doesn't accept defeat ever. His pride won't allow it. You're not alone this time, Tom reminded her, taking her hands in his. I won't let him hurt you. Tessa searched his face, as if trying to gauge the truth of his words. Why, she asked softly, why would you risk involving yourself in my problems? Tom knew the answer instantly, though it terrified him to acknowledge it even to himself. Instead of speaking, he raised one hand to gently brush a curl from her cheek, the gesture conveying what he wasn't ready to say. Tessa leaned into his touch, understanding in her eyes. I'm afraid, she admitted. Not just of him, but of what he represents. I came here to start over, to be independent. And you have, Tom assured her. Whatever happens with Blackmore doesn't change who you've become. She smiled weakly. The frightened Boston girl trying to walk past the observant cowboy. Until he asked who hurt you, Tom completed, remembering their first real interaction. They sat in silence for a moment, the festival sounds distant through the schoolhouse walls. Finally, Tom spoke. We should return to the boarding house. It's getting late and you need rest. Tessa nodded, allowing him to help her to her feet. What will we do? She asked. Tonight, nothing, Tom answered. Tomorrow, we'll face him together. Make it clear you're not returning to Boston. They walked back through town, the festival winding down as families headed home. At the boarding house steps, Tessa turned to him, her expression resolute despite her evident fatigue. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. Tom took her hand, pressing it briefly to his lips in a gesture that would have shocked him months earlier. Lock your door tonight, he advised. I'll be here first thing tomorrow. She nodded, then surprised him by rising on tiptoe to place a quick, gentle kiss on his cheek before hurrying inside. Tom stood motionless, the warmth of her lips lingering on his skin, his heart hammering against his ribs. As he walked toward the livery to collect his horse for the ride back to the ranch, Tom acknowledged a truth he could no longer deny. He was in love with Tessa Finley, and that love would be tested sooner than either of them had expected. Tom arrived at the boarding house shortly after dawn, having spent a restless night at the ranch bunkhouse. He'd informed Walter of the situation, and the foreman had generously given him the day off, recognizing the seriousness in Tom's manner. Mrs. Patterson answered his knock, her usual cheerful expression replaced by concern. She's in the parlor, she said without preamble, been up since before first light. Hardly touched her breakfast. Tom nodded his thanks, removing his hat as he entered the modest parlor. Tessa sat by the window, a book open but clearly unread in her lap. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair arranged in its usual neat style, but her face showed evidence of a sleepless night. She looked up as he entered, relief flooding her features. Tom. Morning, he greeted softly, taking a seat across from her. How are you holding up? I'm fine, she answered automatically, then sighed at his skeptical expression. No, that's not true. I'm terrified, but also angry. That he thinks he can simply appear and reclaim me like lost property. Tom nodded, admiring her resolve despite everything. Has he attempted to contact you this morning? Not yet, she replied, but he will. Richard is nothing if not persistent. As if summoned by her words, a knock sounded at the front door. Mrs. Patterson hurried to answer it, returning moments later with a small envelope. For Miss Finley, she announced, handing it to Tessa. From that Eastern gentleman at the hotel. Tessa took the envelope with visible reluctance, breaking the seal to extract a single sheet of paper. Her expression remained carefully neutral as she read, but Tom noticed her knuckles whitening where she gripped the page. "He wishes to meet privately," she said finally. "To discuss our future away from," she glanced at Tom apologetically, "interfering locals." Tom kept his expression even, though anger simmered beneath the surface. "And what do you want to do?" Tessa folded the note deliberately, her movements precise. I need to face him, make my position absolutely clear, otherwise he'll never stop." "Not alone," Tom stated firmly. "No," she agreed, surprising him, "not alone." They decided to meet Richard at the cafe, a public location where his behavior would necessarily be constrained. As they walked through town, Tom noticed Tessa straightening her posture, lifting her chin, preparing for battle in her own quiet way. Richard was already seated when they arrived, his expression souring as he saw Tom accompanying Tessa. He rose with practiced courtesy nonetheless, pulling out a chair for Tessa while pointedly ignoring Tom. "I requested a private meeting," he said coolly as they sat. "Mr. Ellis is here at my invitation," Tessa replied with equal coolness. "Anything you wish to say to me can be said in his presence." Richard's jaw tightened momentarily before he forced a smile. "As you wish. Though I fail to see what a ranch hand could contribute to our discussion." Tom remained silent, letting Tessa set the terms of the confrontation. She sat perfectly straight, hands folded in her lap, every inch the Boston lady despite her frontier surroundings. "There is nothing to discuss, Richard," she stated clearly. "I am not returning to Boston. I am not renewing our engagement. My life is here now." Richard leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Your father is unwell, Tessa. This estrangement is taking a toll on his health. Would you be so selfish as to ignore that?" Tom watched Tessa falter slightly at this information, concern flashing across her features before she composed herself. "I'm sorry to hear about father's health," she said carefully, "but that doesn't change my decision." "Think about what you're throwing away," Richard pressed, his tone becoming persuasive. "Your position in society, your father's good name. Financial security, all for what?" He gestured dismissively around the modest cafe. "A teaching position in a frontier backwater, living in a boarding house with no prospects." "I have prospects," Tessa countered. "I have built a life here, a respected position, friends who value me for myself, not for my family connections." Richard's gaze flicked to Tom, assessment and dismissal in a single glance. "Ah yes, your cowboy friend. Is that what this is about, some romantic frontier fantasy?" Tom felt his hands clench beneath the table but maintained his outward calm. This wasn't his fight to lead. "My relationship with Mr. Ellis is not your concern," Tessa replied evenly. "My decision was made long before I met him." Richard leaned back, his expression calculating. "Your father has authorized me to offer a compromise. Return to Boston, fulfill your family obligations, and after a suitable period, if you still wish to teach, arrangements can be made. Somewhere civilized, Philadelphia perhaps, or Chicago." For the first time, Tom saw Tessa hesitate. The offer was cunningly crafted to appeal to her sense of duty while appearing reasonable. "And our engagement," she asked carefully, "can remain unofficial," Richard replied smoothly. "For now." Tom recognized the strategy, get her back to Boston by any means, then reassert control once she was isolated from her new support system. The thought of Tessa trapped in that situation made his blood run cold. "May I have time to consider?" Tessa asked, her voice betraying nothing of her thoughts. Richard smiled, triumph flickering in his eyes. "Of course, I'll be in town for 3 more days. More than enough time for you to pack your belongings." He rose, dropping coins on the table for their untouched coffee. "I'll call tomorrow for your answer." With a curt nod to Tom and a possessive touch to Tessa's shoulder that made her flinch almost imperceptibly, he departed. Silence stretched between them after Richard's exit. Tom studied Tessa's face, trying to read her thoughts. "You're not actually considering his offer," he said finally, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Tessa looked up, surprise in her eyes. "Of course not, but arguing further would have been pointless. Richard only hears what he wants to hear." Relief flooded through Tom, followed immediately by shame that he doubted her. "I'm sorry. I thought..." That I might be swayed by mention of my father, she finished for him. It's a reasonable concern. Richard knows my vulnerabilities well. She hesitated, then added softly, but he doesn't know how I've changed. Who I've become. Tom reached across the table, covering her hand with his. And who is that? He asked. A small smile curved her lips. Someone stronger than I ever imagined I could be. Someone who knows what she wants. And what do you want, Tessa? The question was barely above a whisper. Her eyes met his, unflinching. A life of my own choosing, here in Silver Creek. She turned her hand beneath his, their fingers intertwining. With you, if that's what you want, too. The admission hung between them, honest, vulnerable, and braver than anything Tom had done in years of facing physical dangers. He found himself at a crossroads, the path of solitude he'd followed for so long diverging from a new possibility he'd never allowed himself to imagine. I want that, he admitted, the words feeling like both surrender and victory. More than I've wanted anything in a very long time. Tessa's smile deepened, though concern still shadowed her eyes. Richard won't give up easily. Neither will we, Tom assured her, squeezing her hand gently. They left the cafe together, Tom's arm supporting Tessa as they walked back toward the boarding house. The town continued its normal activities around them, unaware of the battle being waged in their midst, a battle not of guns or fists but of wills and futures. As they reached the boarding house steps, Tom turned to Tessa. I need to ride back to the ranch this afternoon. Walter needs all hands to move cattle to winter pasture before the weather turns. Concern flickered across her features. Will you be gone long? Just overnight, he promised. I'll be back tomorrow before Richard comes calling. Tessa nodded, though uncertainty lingered in her expression. I'll be fine, she assured him. Mrs. Patterson is quite the guardian. She already threatened to take her broom to Richard if he appears uninvited. Tom smiled at the image of the diminutive landlady facing down the Boston gentleman. Smart woman, still, lock your door tonight. I will, Tessa promised. Tom hesitated, then leaned forward to press a gentle kiss to her forehead, a chaste gesture by frontier standards, but significant for both of them. Until tomorrow, he said softly. As he rode toward the Circle M, Tom found his thoughts in turmoil. For years, he'd convinced himself that isolation was safety, that caring for another person meant risking the devastation he'd witnessed in his mother. Now, faced with the possibility of losing Tessa before their story had properly begun, he recognized the flaw in his reasoning. Avoiding love didn't protect from pain, it merely guaranteed emptiness. By the time he reached the ranch, Tom had made a decision that would alter the course of his life, regardless of what tomorrow might bring. Tom returned to Silver Creek earlier than planned the following day, pushing his horse to a brisk pace as unease grew within him. The cattle move had gone smoothly, allowing him to depart at first light with Walter's blessing. His concern proved justified when he reached the boarding house to find Mrs. Patterson wringing her hands on the porch. "Oh, Tom," she called as he dismounted, "thank goodness you're back." "What's happened?" he demanded, his heart racing. "That Boston fellow came last night," she explained, indignation coloring her voice. "After dinner, all charm and manners. Asked to speak with Tessa in the parlor. I allowed it, my mistake, but left the door open and stayed within earshot." Tom's jaw tightened. What did he do? Started reasonable enough, but when she refused his offer again, his true nature showed itself. "Mrs. Patterson continued. His voice got quiet, the dangerous kind of quiet. I intervened, told him to leave my house. He did, but not before telling Tessa he'd return this morning with proof that would change her mind. "Where is she now?" Tom asked, scanning the street anxiously. "At the schoolhouse, said she had lessons to prepare." Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "She's putting on a brave face, but she's frightened, Tom, I can tell." Tom thanked the woman and remounted, urging his horse toward the schoolhouse at the far end of town. As he approached, he saw two figures on the porch, Tessa and Richard, the latter gesturing emphatically while Tessa stood with her arms crossed defensively. Tom dismounted quickly, covering the remaining distance on foot. As he drew closer, he caught fragments of Richard's speech. "Official commitment from the courts," Richard was saying, waving a document. "Your father has been declared unfit to manage his affairs due to declining health. As his appointed guardian and your fiancé, I have legal authority." Ex-fiancé, Tessa interrupted, her voice steady despite her pale face. And I'm of legal age. You have no authority over me. Richard's expression hardened. This document says otherwise. Given your father's condition and your emotional fragility, the court has granted me temporary guardianship over both of you. Tom reached the bottom of the schoolhouse steps, his presence causing both to turn. The relief in Tessa's eyes contrasted sharply with the cold fury in Richard's. This is a private matter, Richard stated flatly. I suggest you continue on your way, Cowboy. Tom, Tessa said, reaching out one hand toward him. He claims to have legal papers giving him authority over me. Tom climbed the steps to stand beside her, taking her outstretched hand. May I see these papers? He asked, keeping his tone neutral despite his growing anger. Richard hesitated, then thrust the document forward with obvious reluctance. Not that you'd understand legal terminology, he added dismissively. Tom took the papers, studying them carefully. His expression revealed nothing as he read, but inwardly his suspicions grew. Finally, he handed the document back. These appear to concern Tessa Finley of Boston, Tom stated calmly. Daughter of Howard Finley. Yes, obviously, Richard snapped. Tom turned to Tessa. Is that your full name, Tessa? Understanding dawned in her eyes. No, she answered clearly. My name is Tessa, just Tessa. And my father is Harold Finley. Richard's expression froze, a muscle twitching in his jaw. A clerical error, he said quickly. The substance remains valid. I think not, Tom countered. These papers concern someone else entirely, assuming they're legitimate at all, which I doubt. You have no legal authority here, Mr. Blackmore. Richard's composure cracked, naked rage flashing across his features. You backwater nobody, he snarled. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? The connections I have, I could destroy this entire miserable town with a few telegrams. Yet here you are, Tom observed calmly, resorting to forgery because you can't accept that a woman has rejected you. Richard's hand moved toward his coat and Tom tensed, ready for a weapon. Instead, the Bostonian pulled out a flask, taking a long swallow before returning it to his pocket. This isn't over, Richard stated, his voice controlled again but laced with malice. Tessa belongs in Boston with her own kind. One way or another, she'll return with me. The threat hung in the air, unmistakable despite its vagueness. Tom stepped forward, placing himself between Richard and Tessa. I think you should leave, Tom said quietly. Take the afternoon stage back east. Richard laughed without humor. Or what? Will you challenge me to a duel, Cowboy? Draw pistols at high noon like in those ridiculous dime novels? No, Tom replied evenly. But I will inform Sheriff Dawson about your attempted fraud, and about your history of violence against Miss Finley. The color drained from Richard's face. You wouldn't dare spread such slander. It's not slander if it's true, Tessa spoke up, her voice stronger now. I should have reported you in Boston. I won't make that mistake again. Richard looked between them, calculating his options. Finally, he straightened his jacket with exaggerated care. This conversation isn't finished, he stated coldly. We'll continue it when you're alone. He turned and descended the steps, his movements controlled but tension evident in every line of his body. Tom watched until he disappeared around the corner toward the hotel before turning to Tessa. Are you all right? He asked gently. She nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. I knew he was desperate, but forgery, claiming guardianship, it's beyond what even I expected from him. Tom led her into the schoolhouse, closing the door behind them. You shouldn't be alone until he's gone, he said firmly. Richard is unpredictable, and that makes him dangerous. I can't hide forever, Tessa sighed, sinking into her chair behind the teacher's desk. Not forever, Tom agreed. Just until the stage leaves tomorrow. Tessa looked up at him, worry clear in her eyes. What if he doesn't take it? What if he stays in Silver Creek just to torment me? Tom knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Then we'll face that together. But I think his pride will force him to leave once he realizes he can't intimidate you into returning. You don't know Richard, she said softly. He doesn't accept defeat. Tom considered this, recognizing the genuine fear behind her words. There's another option, he said slowly, an idea forming. One that would make his claims invalid even if they weren't forged. Tessa looked at him questioningly. What do you mean? Tom took a deep breath, suddenly aware he was about to take a leap from which there would be no return. Marry me. Her eyes widened in shock. What? Marry me, he repeated, more confident now that the words were out. Not just because of Richard, though that would settle the matter legally. Marry me because I love you, Tessa, because these past months have shown me that my life is better with you in it. Tessa stared at him, speechless, her eyes filling with tears. Tom, I know it's sudden, he continued quickly, and maybe not how either of us imagined this happening. But I've been saving for land of my own. I have enough for a small homestead not far from town. It wouldn't be much at first, but we could build something together. A tear spilled down her cheek as she searched his face. Are you certain? You've always said you preferred being alone. Tom smiled, reaching up to gently brush away her tear. I was wrong, terribly wrong. I thought avoiding attachments meant avoiding pain, but all it really meant was avoiding life. He squeezed her hands gently. I love you, Tessa Finley. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me. Tessa's expression transformed, joy breaking through her fears like sunlight through storm clouds. Yes, she whispered, then more firmly, yes, I'll marry you, Tom Ellis. Tom pulled her into his arms, his heart hammering with a mixture of elation and disbelief. She fit against him perfectly, her arms encircling his neck as he held her close, breathing in the lavender scent of her hair. When they finally separated, both were smiling despite the circumstances that had precipitated the proposal. When, Tessa asked, practicality asserting itself. Today, Tom suggested. Reverend Matthews would perform the ceremony, I'm sure. We could have witnesses from town, people who know us both. Tessa considered this, then nodded decisively. Yes, today. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Tom escorted Tessa to the boarding house where an ecstatic Mrs. Patterson helped her prepare, then visited Reverend Matthews to arrange the ceremony. By mid-afternoon, word had spread throughout Silver Creek, and the small church was filled with townspeople gathered to witness the unexpected wedding. Tom stood at the altar in his best clothes, not formal by Eastern standards, but clean and respectable. Sheriff Dawson stood beside him as best man, having been informed of the full situation and positioning deputies near the church in case Richard attempted to interfere. When the church door opened and Tessa appeared, Tom forgot to breathe. She wore a simple cream-colored dress, not a wedding gown, but beautiful nonetheless. Mrs. Patterson had woven flowers into her chestnut hair, which fell in soft waves around her shoulders. But it was her expression that captivated him, radiant with happiness and certainty despite the circumstances that had accelerated their union. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. They exchanged simple vows, promising to love, honor, and protect each other through whatever life might bring. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Tom kissed his bride with a tenderness that belied the strength of his emotions. The community celebrated with an impromptu reception at the cafe, everyone contributing what they could to mark the occasion. Through it all, Tom remained alert, watching for any sign of Richard, but the Bostonian never appeared. It was Sheriff Dawson who delivered the news as the celebration wound down. Blackmore booked passage on tomorrow's stage, he informed them quietly, paid in full and requested his luggage be loaded in the morning. Seems he's admitted defeat. Relief washed over Tessa's face. Is it really over? She asked, half afraid to believe it. Looks that way, Dawson confirmed, though I'll make sure he boards that stage personally. Tom thanked the sheriff, then turned to his wife, the words still new and wondrous in his mind. Shall we go home, Mrs. Ellis? He asked softly. Tessa smiled, love shining in her eyes. Home, she repeated. Yes, I'd like that very much. They spent their wedding night at Tom's modest quarters at the Circle M, having arranged to stay there while preparations for their own homestead were completed. As they rode double on Tom's horse under a canopy of stars, Tessa leaned back against his chest. When did you know, she asked, that you loved me? Tom considered the question, his arms secure around her waist. I think I started falling the moment you tried to walk past me in the store, he admitted. But I knew for certain at the creek, watching you laugh in the water like you'd finally found freedom. She twisted slightly to look up at him. I knew when you asked who hurt me, she said softly. Not because you were prying, but because you genuinely cared. No one had ever seen me that clearly before. Tom bent to kiss her gently, the horse continuing steadily beneath them. "I'll always see you, Tessa Ellis, always." The following spring found Tom and Tessa Ellis settled on their own land, 160 acres nestled in a valley just 3 miles from Silver Creek. The cabin Tom had built through the winter was small but solid, with windows that caught the morning sun and a wide porch where they often sat in the evenings, watching the Montana sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. Tessa continued teaching, riding to town on a gentle mare Tom had trained specifically for her. In the afternoons, she returned to work alongside her husband, learning the skills needed for frontier life with determination and occasional laughter at her own mistakes. Tom had never known such contentment. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for years had vanished, replaced by a partnership that strengthened him rather than making him vulnerable. They faced the challenges of homesteading together, the harsh weather, the physical labor, the occasional lean times when crops or cattle prices disappointed. On the first anniversary of their wedding, they sat together on their porch, Tessa nestled against Tom's side as they watched stars appear in the darkening sky. Her hand rested protectively over her abdomen, where their first child had just begun to make its presence known. "Are you happy?" Tom asked, his hand covering hers. Tessa tilted her face up to his, love evident in every line of her expression. "Completely," she answered without hesitation. "Are you?" Tom nodded, thinking of the long journey that had brought them to this moment. From a grieving boy determined never to risk his heart again, to a man who had found strength rather than weakness in loving another person. "I spent so many years believing that caring for someone meant making yourself vulnerable," he reflected. "That love was a liability on the frontier." "And now," Tessa prompted gently, "now I understand that real strength comes from having something worth fighting for," he answered, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead. "Someone worth coming home to." Tessa smiled, settling more comfortably against him as the first stars winked to life above their home, their future. The painful pasts that had shaped them both still existed in memory, but no longer defined them or limited what they could become together. In the distance, Silver Creek's lights twinkled like earthbound stars, the town that had brought them together continuing its own story. But here, on this porch, on this land, Tom and Tessa Ellis had begun a new narrative, one built on the understanding that even in the harsh reality of the frontier, love wasn't a weakness to be avoided but a foundation to build upon. "I love you," Tom whispered into the gathering darkness. "And I love you," Tessa answered, her voice carrying all the certainty that had been missing when they first met, when she had tried to walk past the cowboy until he asked who hurt her. Some questions, they had both learned, changed everything, and some answers built futures neither could have imagined alone.